Picture this. You are a young bride named Margot, no more than 15 winters old, standing at the doorway of a cold stone cottage in the year 1347 A.D. Your bare feet rest on rushes scattered across the floor, brittle stalks that crackle under each nervous step. A single candle flickers in the corner, its weak flame fighting against the dark, stretching your shadow long and thin across the wall. The air is heavy, carrying the smell of wet wool, smoke from the hearth, and bodies that rarely feel the touch of soap. This is the chamber where your new life begins. Your husband, Henrik, approaches the bed. He is nearly twice your age, his weathered face marked by years of hard work and survival. He was not chosen for his smile or his heart, but for the 3 pigs and half-acre of barley he offered your father. This was the bargain struck between 2 families, a transaction made in livestock and land, sealed tonight with your body. You clutch at the rough woolen shift your mother stitched for you, the same one she wore on her own wedding night and her mother before her. A fabric heirloom of duty rather than love. Outside the walls of the cottage, laughter and jeering drift in. Henrik's friends, drunk on ale, shout crude encouragements, beating pots with wooden spoons. They won't leave until they hear proof. Your cries, the creaking bed, the sound that will certify the marriage as legally and spiritually binding. The community does not allow privacy here. Your wedding night is as much theirs as it is yours. Your breath comes in shallow gasps as Henrik's calloused fingers reach for the leather cord at your throat. You remember your mother's whispered warnings, wifely duties, unavoidable pain, the weight of obedience. Yet no words could prepare you for the fear coursing through you in this dimly lit room, for the realization that your body is no longer your own. This is not a love story. This is the reality of medieval intimacy. A world shaped not by tenderness, but by superstition, religious terror, and survival instincts utterly foreign to modern notions of romance and desire. In Margot's century, the marriage bed was never a sanctuary. It was a battlefield, where a woman's flesh became political currency, where the church's doctrine clashed with pagan memories, and where salvation or damnation could hang on the angle of your body beneath a man. Medieval Europe in 1347 was already haunted. This was the year the Black Death began to creep across the continent, though Margot would not yet know it. Rumors of sickness whispered along the trade routes carried by ships and merchants, stories of entire towns collapsing into silence. Fear stained the air, but fear was already a familiar companion. Failed harvests, famine, war, and plague were constant threats, pressing down on the fragile lives of peasants like her. In such a world, marriages were not about companionship. They were about survival, alliances between families sealed in flesh and blood. The community's intrusion into Margot's bedchamber is not a cruelty unique to her village. Across Europe, the bedding ceremony was a ritual of exposure. Guests would drag the bride and groom to their chamber, sometimes stripping them while singing bawdy songs. They would stand outside the door, listening for the groans or laughter that proved consummation. In noble households, this was even more public. The marriage bed displayed before courtiers, the sheets later examined for blood as a witness to virginity. Imagine the pressure. For Margot, failure meant disgrace. If no blood appeared, suspicion would fall. Was she already defiled? Was her family guilty of fraud? In some places, the shame could destroy her life, or end it. Such was the brutal economy of female purity. But even if the marriage was sealed, the dangers did not fade. Medieval intimacy was layered with rules that made every act fraught with consequence. The wrong night, the wrong position, even the wrong intention could condemn your soul to eternal fire. The weight of damnation pressed into every breath Margot drew as Henrik reached for her. Tonight, in this smoky room, Margot stands not just on the threshold of her marriage, but on the edge of an entire culture's anxieties. Her trembling is not only fear of Henrik, it is the crushing awareness that she carries with her the honor of her family, the scrutiny of her neighbors, the authority of the church, and the whispers of ancient superstitions that never fully died. In the candlelight, one girl's terror embodies the entire medieval world, a place where intimacy was never private, never safe, and always political. When Margot's father agreed to marry her off, there were no roses, no tender glances exchanged between young lovers. There was negotiation. Her virginity was not her own. It was her dowry, her family's bargaining chip. 3 pigs, half an acre of barley, and the promise of stronger ties between households. That was the price set upon her body. In the fragile economy of medieval Europe, where every harvest might fail and every winter might starve a family, marriage was a contract of survival. This truth held across every class. For peasants like Margot, a husband's worth lay in his animals, his land, his ability to feed a household. For nobles, the stakes were higher, but the logic the same. Daughters were pawns in games of inheritance and power. A noblewoman might find herself shipped across borders to cement alliances between kingdoms, her body as binding as any treaty. The famous marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Louis VII of France in 1137 was not born of affection, but of territory. She brought with her the vast duchy of Aquitaine, one of the most valuable lands in Europe. Her body, like Margot's, sealed an agreement that shaped the fate of nations. But in villages like Margot's, these transactions were brutally visible. The bedding ceremony reduced the bride and groom to spectacle. Guests would drag the couple to their chamber, sometimes lifting the bride bodily, kicking and screaming onto the marriage bed. They would sing crude songs, mocking the innocence of the young and the awkward fumbling that awaited them. In some regions, guests even insisted on undressing the bride themselves, pulling away her shift while laughing, before thrusting her toward the groom. It was not romance. It was humiliation wrapped in ritual. For Margot, the eyes of her neighbors still burned on her even through the cottage walls. They waited outside, clapping tankards, listening for the sounds that would confirm the contract was sealed. It was not enough for 2 families to exchange promises. The village demanded proof of consummation. Without it, the marriage was void. Without it, the pigs and barley might be returned, and Margot herself returned in disgrace, branded as spoiled goods. Virginity was more than a personal trait. It was an emblem of family honor, a currency more valuable than silver. The hymen, misunderstood and mystified, was imagined as a divine seal of purity, intact until the rightful husband claimed it. A girl who lost it before marriage, whether by choice, coercion, or accident, threatened not only her own future, but her entire family's reputation. The weight of this expectation crushed young brides. Stories circulated of girls pricking their own fingers before bed, smuggling chicken blood beneath the sheets, anything to stain the linen red and spare themselves ruin. Others, less fortunate, faced brutal consequences if no blood appeared. In parts of Europe, a bride could be returned to her father in shame, or worse, beaten or killed for fraud. Virginity was life insurance. To lose it outside marriage was to invite death. This brutal reality coexisted with a strange irony. While women were punished for any suspicion of impurity, men were rarely judged for their conduct. A groom could enter his marriage bed already experienced, having visited the village brothel or shared a servant's body without consequence. The imbalance was staggering. For Margot, a single drop of blood determined her worth. For Henrik, the only proof required was his ability to perform. Even among nobles, where ceremonies glittered with jewels and silks, the underlying logic remained the same. Princesses were sent abroad with dowries of land and coin, sometimes married by proxy before they had ever met their husbands. A girl might be betrothed at 6, married at 12, her body pledged before she understood what marriage meant. A chronicler of the French court once remarked that a noble daughter was like a key. Once given to another house, she unlocked the fortune of her family. In Margot's world, however, the exchange was smaller, but no less brutal. Her father's household gained 3 pigs and a patch of barley. Henrik gained a young bride who would bear him children and work beside him in the fields. And Margot? She gained a life not of her choosing, a place in a stranger's bed, and a role she had no power to refuse. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not a story of love. It was a ledger entry, a bargain struck, a social contract enforced by ritual, gossip, and law. Margot's trembling on her wedding night was not only fear of her husband. It was the terror of failure, of dishonoring her family, of being cast out as worthless in a society where worth was measured in purity, fertility, and obedience. Even within marriage, Margot's life was not her own. Her body belonged not just to Henrik, but to the church that dictated what could and could not happen between them. The medieval church taught that intimacy, even between husband and wife, was dangerous if not carefully controlled. It was not a gift of affection, but a potential sin that could weigh on the soul for eternity. Centuries earlier, church fathers like St. Jerome had warned that a man who loved his wife too ardently was an adulterer. Love itself, if it strayed too far into pleasure, was corruption. Passion was suspect. A kiss could be indulgence, desire could be damnation. What was holy was duty, cold and clinical, the act of procreation. By the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest theologians of the age, codified the Church's position in his Summa Theologica. According to him, intercourse was only acceptable under suffocatingly strict conditions, not on Sundays, not on feast days, not during Lent, not during Advent, not during pregnancy, not during menstruation, not during breastfeeding, not during daylight, and never for pleasure alone, and above all, only in one position, the man above, the woman below, face to face. Anything else, woman on top, from behind, or any act outside penetration, was branded against nature, a direct affront to God. If all these rules were followed faithfully, medieval couples were left with perhaps 50 permissible nights of intimacy a year. 50 opportunities, not to delight in one another, but to fulfill a duty, to bring children into the world, and to avoid the eternal flames of hell. And the penalties for disobedience were not vague threats. Confession manuals, the how-to guides for priests interrogating their flocks, listed every possible sexual act alongside the punishments they required. A man who climaxed outside of his wife's body might be assigned weeks of fasting on bread and water. A woman who dared initiate intimacy could be told to perform humiliating penances. These books cataloged intimacy with almost voyeuristic detail, yet their purpose was clear: surveillance, control, and fear. Margot would have absorbed these rules long before her wedding night. Her mother, bound by the same anxieties, would have whispered them with equal parts warning and resignation. The village priest would have reminded her during confession, ensuring that even in her most private moments, she could not escape the church's gaze. Now, imagine Margot on a Wednesday during Lent. Henrik reaches for her, driven not by doctrine but by desire or habit. What choice does she have? If she refuses, she risks his anger, an anger she has no legal protection against. If she yields, she endangers her own soul, for the Church has made clear that such an act on a holy day is mortal sin. She stands in an impossible trap, damned if she resists, damned if she consents. And it was not just Margot. Across Europe, countless wives lay awake with the same dread, torn between obedience to their husbands and obedience to God. Desire was not an excuse, it was a threat. A husband who loved his wife too tenderly risked sinning. A wife who felt pleasure risked corruption. Pleasure itself was the enemy. Yet beneath these doctrines, people remained human. Desire could not be erased by decree. It simmered beneath the surface of confessionals and penitential manuals, in whispered laughter at taverns, and secret poems passed among the literate few. Even the rigid rules of Aquinas and Jerome revealed an uncomfortable truth. The Church obsessed over intimacy precisely because it was irresistible. The more it condemned, the more it revealed its fear of the power that lay in flesh. For Margot, that fear was tangible. As she lay beneath Henrik, she carried not only his weight, but the invisible presence of priests, saints, and watchful angels. Every movement could tip the balance between grace and damnation. The marriage bed was no sanctuary. It was a courtroom, and every night was a trial. For Margot, the act of marriage was not the beginning of partnership. It was the beginning of obedience. The law, the church, and society all agreed. A wife was her husband's property. Her will was secondary, her body a tool for his use. The concept of marital rape did not exist in her world, because within marriage, consent was irrelevant. The marriage vows themselves were considered permanent consent. a lifelong surrender of autonomy. If Henrik wanted her, she could not refuse. To deny him was not only rebellion but sin, for wives were commanded by Scripture to submit as the Church submits to Christ. Even the legal codes of the age confirmed his right to discipline her. The Saxon Spiegel, a medieval German law book, spelled it plainly. A man might beat his wife moderately to correct her disobedience. In England, common law echoed the same sentiment. A husband's violence was not abuse, it was governance. This meant that every refusal, every hesitation Margot might feel, could be met with punishment. A raised hand, a slap, a beating, such acts were not crimes, but expected corrections. Neighbors who overheard the sounds of a quarrel would not intervene, for the household was Henrik's realm, and discipline was his right. Imagine her position. Henrik reaches for her on a forbidden day, perhaps during Lent or a holy feast, and she whispers a timid refusal. His face hardens. Does she insist and risk his wrath, knowing he can strike her with impunity? Or does she yield, knowing that by yielding she endangers her soul with mortal sin? This was the cruel paradox women bore, damned either by heaven or by earth, but never free. The burden extended beyond the marriage bed. A wife owed obedience in labor, in speech, in silence. Her tasks, cooking, weaving, tending livestock, bearing children, were endless, yet her labor was taken for granted. If she faltered, Henrik had the law and the community on his side to correct her. A wife's disobedience was not just a personal failure. It was a disruption of the divine order, where God ruled man, man ruled wife, and wife submitted beneath them both. And yet, beneath these suffocating rules, women whispered their own resistance. Folk tales told of clever wives who tricked their husbands, who feigned illness or devised excuses to delay his advances. Midwives passed on quiet advice about herbs that might dull desire or prevent pregnancy, giving women small pockets of control where the law gave them none. These acts were fragile rebellions, small shields against a system that saw obedience as their only virtue. The psychological weight of such obedience was immense. Imagine living in a world where your every action was judged not just by your husband, but by neighbors, priests, and even God himself, where silence was safety and defiance was danger. For Margot, every night brought a new calculation: risk Henrik's hand or risk her soul. Every dawn she rose, her obedience intact, but her spirit chipped away. The medieval home was no sanctuary for wives. It was a battleground of power disguised as duty, of violence disguised as order. And in that battleground, women like Margot bore the burden in silence, their obedience demanded, their fear dismissed, their survival uncertain. To truly grasp Margot's world, we must step into the minds of the physicians and scholars whose books shaped how men and women understood the body. For them, Margot was not an equal to Henrik in flesh or spirit. She was a defective man, a half-formed creation, an inversion of the male ideal. Her body was not her own. It was a distorted mirror of his. This belief came from ancient authorities whose words still ruled the universities of Europe. Galen, the Roman physician, argued that women possessed the same sexual organs as men, only turned inward. The vagina was an inverted penis, the uterus a set of internal testicles, the ovaries a lesser counterpart to male seed. Centuries later, medieval scholars repeated these claims in Latin manuscripts, binding them with the weight of medical authority. To them, Margot's body was incomplete, passive, and dependent on Henrik's. And yet, despite being labeled defective, women's bodies were also imagined as dangerous. The wandering womb was one of the most feared ailments of the Middle Ages. Physicians believed the uterus could slip its moorings and drift through the body, suffocate in the heart or choke in the throat. A woman, fainting or gasping for breath, might be said to suffer from her womb rising too high. Madness, hysteria, even sudden death, all could be blamed on this restless organ. The treatments were as strange as the diagnosis. To lure the womb back into place, doctors prescribed fumigation, sweet-smelling herbs and perfumes applied to the vagina to entice it downward, while foul-smelling substances like burning hair or sulfur were held near the nose to drive it away from the head. A woman's body became a battlefield of sense, her very breath a negotiation with an organ thought to have a will of its own. Bloodletting was another common prescription. Physicians, guided by the theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, believed that illness arose from imbalance. Women, being colder and wetter by nature, were thought to suffer from excess humors, particularly during menstruation. If her cycle faltered, if her bleeding was too heavy or too light, doctors feared poison would build within her. The solution? Open a vein, let the excess drain, and restore balance. But the errors went deeper still. Scholars believed that for conception to occur, both husband and wife must experience climax. A woman who failed to find pleasure, they claimed, could not conceive. This twisted logic would later be weaponized in courts. If a woman became pregnant after rape, it was taken as evidence that she must have secretly enjoyed the act. Desire was not only misunderstood, it was distorted into proof against the vulnerable. Margot, like other village women, would not read these Latin texts herself, but their influence trickled down through priests, midwives, and gossip. She would hear warnings about her womb wandering if she resisted intimacy, or about poisons festering if her monthly bleeding went astray. The knowledge of her body, passed to her by authority figures, was tangled with fear and error. And yet, women did not live entirely by these male-made texts. Alongside the fumigations and bloodletting of university medicine, there thrived an underground tradition of women's healing. Midwives, herbalists, and wise women carried knowledge passed from mother to daughter. Which herbs soothed cramps, which teas brought on or delayed bleeding, which charms offered protection during childbirth. These remedies were not written in Latin, but in the whispered language of survival. Still, Margot lived under the shadow of male authority. In the eyes of physicians, priests, and husbands alike, her body was both lesser and more dangerous, defective, unstable, unpredictable. It was a mystery to be controlled, a vessel to be used, never a self to be understood. In that misunderstanding lay centuries of fear, superstition, and suffering. For Margot, as for every woman of her age, fertility was both blessing and curse. To bear children was her sacred duty, the very purpose of her marriage, yet each pregnancy carried the shadow of death. 1 in 3 women died in childbirth, their lives spent in a desperate gamble for the continuation of family lines. To avoid conception was dangerous, condemned by church and law alike, yet the need for control was undeniable. Thus, a secret world of remedies, rituals, and whispered advice grew beneath the watchful eyes of priests. In the forests surrounding her village, women gathered plants by moonlight, guided by traditions older than Christianity itself. Pennyroyal and tansy were brewed into bitter teas that might prevent conception, though the line between an effective dose and a deadly one was perilously thin. Mandrake root, with its human-like shape, was carried as a charm, believed to coax fertility or protect against miscarriage. These objects became talismans of survival, clutched by hands too desperate to care whether the church called them magic. The church, of course, did condemn them. In sermons, priests thundered that to meddle with conception was to defy God's will. Herbal knowledge, especially when practiced by women, was denounced as witchcraft. Yet even the most devout Christians could not abandon these remedies entirely. A woman might pray to St. Margaret, patron of safe childbirth, while at the same time burying a piece of her afterbirth beneath the hearth to ensure future fertility. Faith and folk practice existed side by side, their boundaries blurred. Other methods were stranger still. Women were told to jump backwards 7 times after intercourse, or to drink wine mixed with powdered bees. Some remedies were deadly. Mercury, lead, and arsenic found their way into potions promising to prevent pregnancy, killing countless women who sought only relief. In desperation, many risked poison rather than another perilous birth. Unwanted pregnancy carried heavy consequences. For a married woman, it could mean further exhaustion, another brush with death. For an unmarried woman, it could mean ruin. Villages turned against mothers who could not name a husband. Their children, branded illegitimate, were shunned. Some women, trapped in shame, turned to the darkest option, infanticide. Though condemned by both law and church, It remained a whispered last resort, the final act of despair in a society that offered no mercy. And yet, even with these risks, the desire to influence fertility endured. Marriage contracts were written with the expectation of children, preferably sons. Without heirs, families risked losing land, dowries, and honor. A barren wife could be cast aside, her worth measured only in the children she could or could not produce. Margot knew that every month her body became a battlefield of hope and fear, her womb scrutinized not as her own, but as her family's future. The church called such knowledge sinful, the work of witches. But to the women who lived it, it was survival. Between the pages of theology and the whispers of the village hearth lay two worlds, one of condemnation, the other of desperate necessity. Margot's world was both. By day, she knelt in church, reciting prayers for fertility. By night, she might hold a sprig of tansy beneath her pillow, or listen to the whispered counsel of a midwife who risked being branded a witch. In this secret dance between faith and folk wisdom, women carved out fragile spaces of power. The knowledge they held was dangerous not only to their own lives, but to the order of society itself. For to control fertility was to challenge the destiny the church insisted God had chosen. And in Margot's trembling hands, whether clutching a rosary or a hidden herb, lay the impossible balance between duty, survival, and forbidden hope. When Margot was led to Henrik's bed, she carried with her something more valuable than pigs, more precious than barley, her virginity. In medieval Europe, this fragile condition was her dowry, the seal of her family's honor. A father who gave away a daughter no longer untouched gave away not only shame, but proof of fraud. The hymen became a form of currency, and blood its receipt. The ritual of proof was cruel. After the bedding ceremony, once the jeering guests had dragged bride and groom to their chamber, once the door had shut and the room fell into tense silence, another expectation lingered. By morning, the sheets must bear stains of blood, visible evidence that Margot had been pure and that Henrik had fulfilled his duty. Those sheets could be paraded before the household, sometimes even displayed in the village square as public testimony that the marriage was both consummated and legitimate. But nature is rarely so obedient. Many women do not bleed upon first penetration. Others might bleed from causes unrelated to virginity, riding a horse, carrying heavy loads, or simply from the natural variance of their bodies. Medieval medicine, blind to these realities, insisted the hymen was a solid veil, always torn during first intercourse. If no blood appeared, suspicion sharpened. Was Margot already spoiled? Had her father deceived Henrik? The consequences could be brutal: annulment, disgrace, even death. Stories circulated of desperate brides pricking their fingers beneath the sheets, letting droplets fall to mimic the expected evidence. Some carried bladders of chicken blood hidden between thighs, bursting beneath the weight of the groom. These tricks were whispered from mother to daughter, a secret arsenal against humiliation. Yet discovery could be deadly, confirming deceit rather than purity. The law gave sharp teeth to these suspicions. Consummation was not a private matter. It was a legal requirement. A marriage not sealed with flesh could be annulled, freeing the husband to reclaim his dowry or pursue another bride. Church courts, tasked with overseeing such cases, descended to extraordinary invasions of privacy. They interrogated husbands and wives separately, pressing for details of what had or had not occurred on the wedding night. In some cases, midwives were called to examine the bride, searching her body for signs of penetration. Even impotence was treated as legal evidence. A husband accused of failing to consummate could be subjected to humiliating tests. Witnesses might observe as he was ordered to prove his virility with his wife or with other women appointed by the court. Failure meant annulment, his manhood stripped as publicly as a thief's honor. For women like Margot, however, no such test could prove their innocence. Only blood on linen could. Virginity thus became a paradox, a private condition subjected to public judgment, a biological accident inflated into sacred law. For men, marriage was validated by performance. For women, by suffering. The consummation ritual was less about intimacy than about spectacle. less about two lives joined than about a community satisfied that honor had been preserved. Margot, lying beneath Henrik, bore not only his weight, but the gaze of her village, her family, and her God. Whether she bled or not, her fate might already be sealed, not by her choices, but by a flawed understanding of her body, elevated to the status of divine truth. For Margot, the bed was a narrow place, not only in space but in possibility. The Church had decreed that there was but one proper way for man and wife to unite, the man above, the woman below, facing one another. This, theologians argued, reflected the natural order, male dominance over female submission, and any deviation was sin. The reasoning was cloaked in theology but rooted in fear. To let a woman mount a man was to invert God's plan, to place the weaker vessel above the stronger. From behind, they said, was bestial, dragging human souls closer to the animals they were meant to rule. To touch mouths, to use tongues, to indulge in anything that did not lead directly to procreation, was to flirt with damnation. Even in marriage, intimacy was not for pleasure. It was for duty, for children, and nothing more. Yet humans, then as now, rarely fit themselves neatly into rules. Beneath the weight of penance and surveillance, a shadow world of desire thrived. In smoky taverns and crowded marketplaces, traveling minstrels told fabliaux, comic tales that mocked priests and celebrated sexual mischief. In these stories, millers' wives tricked priests into bed, young girls seduced foolish old men, and lovers tangled in positions the Church would have called monstrous. The laughter they provoked was dangerous laughter, a release valve for a society that outwardly condemned but secretly indulged. Among the nobility, the tension between doctrine and desire took a different shape. Courtly poets like Andreas Capellanus, writing in the 12th century, described elaborate rituals of seduction, games of longing where kisses were weighed, embraces described in detail, and even instructions for how to pleasure a partner circulated discreetly. Such texts suggested that behind palace doors, knowledge of pleasure was not absent, merely hidden. The nobility, cloaked in wealth and privacy, could indulge where peasants risked exposure. But indulgence was perilous. Discovery could mean penance, humiliation, even excommunication. The Church's fear of pleasure was so great that even married couples risked spiritual ruin by loving each other too well. St. Jerome had warned centuries earlier, "He who loves his wife too ardently is an adulterer." The paradox was cruel. Affection between husband and wife, the very bond the Church claimed to sanctify, could itself be condemned. For Margot, these tensions were not distant debates in Latin, but immediate threats. If Henrik demanded a kiss too deep, if he touched her in ways the priest had forbidden, was her soul imperiled? If she dared to find pleasure, was she complicit in sin? Each gesture carried the weight of judgment. And yet, even in villages like hers, people whispered. They passed along fragments of bawdy songs, crude sketches scratched on parchment, knowing smiles exchanged at market. These whispers hinted at a truth larger than doctrine, that desire, though condemned, was irrepressible. So, while Margot trembled beneath Henrik in her cottage, somewhere in a French tavern a minstrel sang of lovers tangled in laughter, and in a noble's chamber a manuscript bound in leather offered instructions on the art of touch. Between the rigid proclamations of the Church and the quiet defiance of human flesh lay the reality of medieval intimacy, a world where desire could never be erased, only hidden, distorted, or feared. Margot's world was not only haunted by priests and neighbors, it was haunted by demons. Medieval people believed that even in the most private of moments, unseen forces prowled in the darkness, waiting to corrupt, seduce, or destroy. The marriage bed was never truly empty. It was shared with the terrors of the imagination, terrors the Church insisted were real. Among the most feared were the succubus and incubus, spirits of lust that preyed on the vulnerable. The succubus was said to be a female demon who slipped into the chambers of men at night, seducing them in their sleep, drawing out their seed to weaken their bodies and damn their souls. The incubus, its male counterpart, assaulted women, forcing itself upon them with inhuman strength. Theologians did not dismiss these as mere tales. They recorded them as facts, debated how they operated, and instructed the faithful on how to resist. The theories were elaborate, almost grotesque. Scholars claimed that succubi collected semen from men, transformed into incubi, and used that stolen seed to impregnate women. Any child born of such unions was considered cursed, part human, part demonic, a living emblem of sin. Women who bore children with deformities or unusual traits were sometimes whispered to have lain with demons, their offspring marked forever. For women like Margot, the line between victim and witch was perilously thin. A woman who confessed to nightly visitations might be pitied, or she might be accused of inviting them. To claim that a demon had come to her bed could be seen as evidence that she consorted willingly, that she was no victim at all, but an accomplice. We now understand phenomena like sleep paralysis, the sensation of being pinned to the bed by an invisible weight, unable to move, as neurological events. But in Margot's time, such experiences were proof of demonic assault. To wake gasping, heart racing, with the memory of a dark figure pressing down upon you, was to believe you had been violated by an incubus. The terror was not only physical, but eternal, for the Church taught that such encounters endangered the soul. The remedies prescribed were no comfort. Exorcisms, fasting, the sprinkling of holy water on the bed, these rituals sought to drive away demons, but they also branded the afflicted as suspect. Some women accused of suffering visitations found themselves burned as witches, their cries lost beneath the roar of flames. Even outside the shadow of demons, sexuality itself was often framed in supernatural terms. Lustful thoughts were whispers of the devil. Nocturnal emissions in men were blamed on succubi. Women who admitted to desire risked being labeled as possessed. Pleasure, so carefully policed by priests, was recast as a weapon of hell. For Margot, this meant that the fear of her wedding night extended beyond Henrik's grasp or the priest's judgment. The very darkness of the room could seem dangerous, the silence alive with imagined wings. A creak of the floorboards, a shadow across the wall. Were these signs of Henrik's stirring, or of something more sinister? Even her own dreams could betray her, for to wake flushed or breathless was to risk believing she had lain with a demon. In such a world, intimacy was layered with dread. Not only was every act monitored by the Church and scrutinized by neighbors, but it was also shadowed by the possibility of unseen violators. Margot's fear was not only of sin or shame, it was of waking in the night and realizing that even in her own bed she was not safe. In Margot's world, a woman's monthly bleeding was not a natural cycle. It was a threat. Medieval medicine, inheriting fears from ancient Rome, taught that menstrual blood was poison, a dangerous substance that corrupted whatever it touched. Pliny the Elder, whose works were still studied centuries after his death, had claimed that a menstruating woman could sour wine, blight crops, dull metal, and drive dogs mad. These beliefs echoed through village gossip and priestly sermons until they became truth. For women, the consequences were suffocating. During her cycle, Margot might be forbidden from preparing food, entering a church, or even touching household tools. Some villages built separate huts or crude shelters outside the community, where menstruating women were sent to wait until the bleeding passed. There, cut off from daily life, they sat with their shame, bearing the weight of Eve's curse. For the Church taught that menstruation was not just biology, but punishment. God's reminder of the first woman's sin in Eden. Each drop of blood was a stain of guilt, renewed month after month. Physicians, bound by humoral theory, saw menstruation through the same distorted lens. To them, blood was one of the 4 vital fluids, and balance was everything. If a woman's flow was too heavy, she risked weakness and death. If it was too light, they warned that toxic blood would accumulate, poisoning her body from within. Their solutions were dangerous: bloodletting, purging, or harsh herbal concoctions meant to restore balance. Some even prescribed intercourse during a woman's cycle, believing that male seed could neutralize the poison within her. And yet, in the silence between women, other knowledge endured. Margot would learn from her mother or from older women in the village how to manage her cycle with makeshift protections, strips of cloth washed and reused, moss gathered from the forest, or sheep's wool pressed into place. She would learn to track her bleeding by the phases of the moon, to anticipate the days of cramping, to sip herbal teas brewed in secret to ease the pain. This hidden wisdom passed from generation to generation, a survival manual wrapped in whispers. But secrecy was necessary. To claim too much knowledge of herbs was to risk suspicion of witchcraft. To speak openly about menstruation was to invite scorn. Menstruating women were feared, but they were also mocked, reduced to cruel jokes in taverns or condemned in sermons as unclean. In the eyes of men, a woman bleeding was both polluted and dangerous, a walking paradox to be managed with fear rather than compassion. Imagine Margot, her belly twisting with cramps, rising early to tend the fire before Henrik woke. She could not tell him why her movements were slower, why her hands trembled as she carried water from the well. To complain was weakness. To reveal her bleeding was shame. And yet the village, steeped in superstition, might already suspect. If the bread failed to rise, if the cow gave no milk, if a storm flattened the barley fields, eyes might turn to her, whispering, "She was bleeding. She caused this." Thus, what should have been a private rhythm of her body became another battlefield of suspicion. Her blood was not her own. It was a weapon others feared she carried against them. Every month she endured not just the pain of her body, but the weight of a culture that made her cycle into a curse, her womanhood into a source of danger. If Margot's body was seen as unstable and dangerous, then the question of whether she and Henrik were even compatible became another layer of anxiety. Medieval thinkers insisted that fertility, pleasure, and even the health of children depended on more than the act itself. They believed the stars, the balance of humors, and the shape of bodies all held sway over what happened in the marriage bed. Physicians, schooled in Galen and Aristotle, taught that every person was governed by the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A husband with a hot temperament, bold, fiery, quick to anger, might be mismatched with a wife who was also hot, creating conflict or infertility. A cold wife paired with a cold husband could mean barrenness. Sexual harmony, they said, required balance, hot with cold, moist with dry. Doctors, hired by wealthy families, would examine brides and grooms before marriage to predict their compatibility. The process was clinical, even dehumanizing. Women's hips measured to guess at fertility, men's genitals inspected for signs of vigor. The scrutiny resembled the appraisal of livestock, with bodies valued for reproduction more than affection. Astrology added another layer of control. Learned men consulted charts to determine auspicious nights for conception. If a couple conceived when the moon was waxing, they were told a son would be born. During waning, a daughter. Stars aligned in certain houses foretold not just the sex, but the temperament of the child: bold or timid, loyal or treacherous. Some families postponed consummation until the heavens were favorable, convinced that destiny itself hung in the balance. This obsession with signs and balances was not confined to noble courts. Even peasants, who had no access to physicians or astrologers, absorbed fragments of these beliefs. Midwives might warn Margot that lying with Henrik during certain phases of the moon would doom her child to weakness. A neighbor might whisper that her narrow hips were a bad omen. Every detail of her body and timing of her intimacy could be recast as a prediction of her worth as a wife and mother. The church, meanwhile, layered spiritual rules atop the medical and astrological ones. Spiritual kinship, such as sharing a godparent, could make a union invalid, condemned as incest. Couples who discovered such connections after years of marriage sometimes had their unions annulled, their children branded illegitimate. For Margot, this meant that not only her body, but her lineage and her baptismal ties could be used against her. To live under such scrutiny was to live in constant fear of failure. If she did not conceive, was it because her womb wandered? Because her humors were unbalanced? Because Henrik's seed was weak? Or because they had chosen the wrong night beneath the stars? Explanations multiplied, each one stripping her of agency, each one locating the problem within her. And yet, behind the rules and theories, there lay a deeper truth. People sought explanations because fertility was fragile. Infant mortality was high. miscarriage common, and many couples struggled to conceive. In their desperation, they turned to the stars, to humors, to priests and midwives alike, searching for patterns in chaos. For Margot, that search became a prison. Every kiss, every touch, every cycle of the moon burdened with meaning she could neither control nor escape. For Margot, the law was not a shield. It was another weapon pointed at her. Medieval justice did not recognize her body as her own. It recognized it only as property, belonging to her father before marriage and to Henrik after. Any violation against her was defined not as harm to Margot herself, but as an insult to the man who owned her. Rape, for instance, was treated as a crime of theft. If a peasant girl was assaulted, the punishment varied depending on her father's status, not her suffering. A nobleman who raped a poor woman might pay a small fine, a price as trivial as the cost of livestock. But if a peasant man assaulted a noblewoman, the penalty could be death, because her honor carried the weight of her family's power. The victim's pain was secondary. What mattered was whose reputation had been tarnished. Adultery was judged with equal cruelty, and always with double standards. A married woman caught with another man could be beaten, mutilated, or even killed by her husband without consequence. Law codes from France to England explicitly granted men this right, but men themselves faced little danger. A husband who slept with prostitutes, with unmarried women, or with the servants in his household was not branded adulterous. His indulgence was tolerated. His wife's desire was a crime. For Margot, this meant every glance, every word spoken to another man could spark suspicion. In villages where everyone knew everyone else's business, gossip was its own form of surveillance. A woman seen speaking too long with the miller, laughing with the blacksmith, or walking alone to the well could be whispered about. That whisper might grow into accusation, and accusation into punishment. Reputation was as fragile as virginity, and just as lethal to lose. The fragility of women's honor made even marriage itself precarious. If Henrik accused Margot of adultery, whether true or not, she had little recourse. The law assumed his word carried more weight than hers. Church courts might demand humiliating tests, forcing her to swear innocence on holy relics, sometimes even subjecting her to trial by ordeal. Plunging her hand into boiling water, for example, with the belief that God would preserve the innocent from burns. A woman's fate might depend not on truth, but on luck, superstition, and the biases of men. And yet, while women bore the brunt of accusation, men faced their own form of humiliation. Impotence, failure to consummate, or weakness in bed was not a private matter, but a public shame. Neighbors and priests could be summoned to investigate, reducing intimate struggles to community spectacle. Honor, in the medieval mind, was inseparable from sexuality, and men and women alike lived in terror of exposure. For Margot, every day was a balancing act. Speak too much, and she risked gossip. Show too little affection, and Henrik might suspect defiance. Show too much, and the church might brand her sinful. The laws, the customs, the constant watchfulness of neighbors, all conspired to remind her that her life was not hers to shape. Medieval law did not exist to protect women like Margot. It existed to preserve order, the order of men over women, of lords over peasants, of the church over all. In that order, women's voices were silenced, their desires criminalized, their reputations always at risk. For Margot, the law was not a promise of justice. It was the ever-present shadow of punishment. If Margot's marriage was a contract of survival, what then of love? In the villages, love was a luxury. Choice mattered little. Her father's agreement carried more weight than her heart. Yet, in the halls of nobles, a strange new culture blossomed in poetry and song, one that worshipped love, but only outside of marriage. This was courtly love, the invention of troubadours in 12th century France. Their verses told of knights who adored ladies from afar, swearing loyalty and enduring suffering in the name of love that was never meant to be fulfilled. The more unattainable the beloved, the purer the devotion. True love, they sang, could not exist within the bonds of marriage where duty smothered passion. It was found instead in longing, in secret glances, in unconsummated yearning. For nobles, this created a strange divide. Marriage was duty, love was fantasy. A countess might be bound to a husband she barely knew, while exchanging verses with a knight who pledged to die for her smile. These games were tolerated, even celebrated, so long as they did not threaten dynastic stability. For peasants like Margot, however, such ideas were distant echoes, carried in song, but far from daily life. The reality of peasant courtship was pragmatic. A girl might favor the blacksmith's son, but if the miller offered better terms to her father, her choice was irrelevant. Yet, even here, traces of affection found their way. Couples met at festivals, exchanged tokens at markets, or spoke briefly while tending flocks. These stolen moments carried risk, for gossip could brand a girl as wanton, but they also carried hope, the fragile dream of love within a world of bargains. Customs emerged to test compatibility. In some regions, betrothed couples were allowed to share a bed, fully clothed, separated by a wooden board called a bundling board. Families hoped to see if affection or fertility might arise, without breaking the church's prohibition on premarital sex. In practice, the board did not always serve as a perfect barrier, but it reflected a curious paradox. Families sought proof of connection, yet feared the consequences of intimacy. Pagan traditions, too, lingered in the shadows of Christian Europe, shaping courtship and fertility rituals. The celebration of May Day was one such survival. Under the guise of gathering flowers and branches to decorate the village, young men and women spent the night in the woods. There, away from the watchful eyes of parents, they danced, drank, and often lay together beneath the trees. By winter, the results of those nights appeared in swollen bellies, and February births surged across Europe. The church railed against the practice, but May Day endured, a festival where desire escaped control. Weddings themselves carried rituals steeped in ancient symbolism. The bride might be showered with grain or nuts, tokens of fertility drawn from older harvest rites. The bed could be blessed with holy water. But beneath the sheets, families sometimes hid herbs or charms meant to ensure conception. These practices blurred the line between Christian sacrament and pagan magic, between sacred ritual and desperate superstition. For Margot, love was not sung by troubadours or cloaked in noble fantasy. Love, if it came at all, would be found in small mercies. Henrik's rare gentleness after a long day, or a moment of laughter shared in the field. Yet even she lived in a world shaped by older currents, by the gossip of bundling, by the wild freedom of May Day, by rituals that mingled the church's blessing with whispers of the old gods. Between fantasy and necessity, between pagan custom and Christian law, medieval courtship revealed the same truth as Margot's life. Intimacy was never free. It was bound by survival, surveilled by community, and haunted by traditions that reached back into the shadows of Europe's past. In Margot's world, intimacy was never hidden long. The church made sure of that. Confession was not just a sacrament of forgiveness, it was a tool of surveillance. Priests were trained to ask pointed, often humiliating questions about the marriage bed. Did you couple on holy days? Did you use positions forbidden by the church? Did you seek pleasure too eagerly? What should have been private was laid bare before the altar, catalogued as sin. By the 13th century, with the rise of the Inquisition, even greater scrutiny arrived. Heretics were tortured not only for their beliefs, but for their intimate lives. Interrogation manuals included astonishingly detailed lists of sexual acts, each described with the precision of obsession, each marked for punishment. A man or woman dragged before inquisitors might be forced to confess to forbidden acts, their words twisted into evidence of heresy. The bedroom was no refuge, it was another courtroom. Punishments for sexual transgressions could be brutal. Women convicted of adultery in some towns were paraded through the streets in shame, their hair shorn, their clothes ripped, a rope around their neck. Others were locked in cages so small they could not stand, left to starve as examples. Men convicted of rape might face castration before execution, though only if their victim was of high enough status to matter. Justice was never equal. It was measured by rank, gender, and power. And yet, beneath this iron framework of control, rebellion flourished. Brothels, though officially condemned, were often licensed by secular authorities. Cities like London, Paris, and Florence maintained red light districts where prostitutes worked openly under regulations that required them to wear distinctive clothing. The church thundered against such places, but lords and kings tolerated them, arguing that prostitution was a necessary evil to protect the virtue of wives and daughters. Hypocrisy lay at the heart of the system. What was condemned from the pulpit was permitted in practice. The infamous chastity belt, often imagined as the cruelest symbol of control, was likely rare in reality. But the very myth of it reveals the fear of female sexuality that permeated the culture. The belief that a woman's body must be locked, guarded, restrained, lest her desire, or another man's, bring ruin. Whether or not iron belts circled women's waists, the social cage was real enough. Still, laughter survived. The same peasants who bowed their heads in confession listened to bawdy songs at markets, where minstrels mocked priests and told tales of adulterous wives outwitting jealous husbands. Nobles, in their private chambers, read manuscripts that contained not only stern advice, but also secret illustrations of positions the church damned. Desire could not be smothered entirely. It seeped out in jokes, in hidden texts, in whispered moments stolen in barns and forests. Margot lived in a world of fear, but also in a world of contradiction. The church's rules were rigid, but people bent them in silence. The punishments were savage, but the temptations constant. Beneath the public gaze of surveillance and the shadow of the Inquisition, there pulsed an underground culture of resistance, proof that even in the most repressive age, human desire refused to be erased. The candlelight still flickers in Margot's cottage. Henrik's shadow looms across the stone wall as he reaches for her, his calloused hands steady, hers trembling. The shouts of drunken men outside fade into silence, but the weight of the world presses in, the weight of law, of custom, of superstition, of faith. In this moment, Margot is not simply a bride. She is a vessel of her family's honor, a target of her community's judgment, a soul balanced precariously between salvation and damnation. Every breath she takes is shaped by rules older than she can name. The church's decrees about how she may lie with her husband, the village's demand for blood as proof of her virginity, the whispered warnings of midwives about wandering wombs and dangerous herbs. Her body is her battlefield, and she cannot surrender or escape. The medieval bedroom was never private. It was a stage where the drama of survival, faith, and control played out. In Margot's trembling hands we glimpse the paradox of her age. Intimacy that was at once the most personal act and the most public one, monitored by priests, neighbors, and even imagined demons. Every gesture carried consequences, eternal damnation, social disgrace, or violent punishment. And yet, through it all, desire endured. Lovers whispered in barns, poets sang of forbidden passion, young couples laughed beneath May-Day trees, and even priests who thundered against lust could not silence their own thoughts. The church sought to chain sexuality with penance and fear, but human longing slipped through the cracks, reshaping itself into rebellion, into laughter, into secret tenderness. Margot's story, though singular, is the story of countless women and men who lived in that age of fire and shadow. Her fear is the fear of generations whose bodies were never fully their own. Her silence is the silence of women whose voices were stifled by law and shame. But within her also lies the unquenchable spark of human resilience, the same resilience that kept love, however fragile, alive in a world determined to suffocate it. The medieval world may feel distant, its customs bizarre, its beliefs alien. Yet, when we strip away the trappings of superstition, what remains is familiar. The struggle between power and vulnerability, between desire and control, between love and fear. These tensions, born in Margot's trembling on her wedding night, still echo in our own time. So, when we look back on that candlelit room in 1347, we do not see only a frightened girl and her husband. We see an entire civilization pressing its weight onto their narrow bed. We see the church, the law, the village, the cosmos itself, all converging on a moment of intimacy that is anything but intimate. Margot's story reminds us that sexuality has never been merely private. It is political, cultural, spiritual, a mirror of the age in which it unfolds. For her, it was terror and duty. For us, it is history, and in that history lies a truth as old as humanity itself. No matter how rigid the rules, how heavy the fear, the longing for connection endures.